The Okanagan is one of BC's prime agricultural areas where fruits and vegetables flourish in the hot summer sun. The relationship between Okanagan people and the farming industry is one of the examples of how Euro-Canadian social, economic, and political structures were replaced by First Nations. The traditional economy produced a wide range of food and materials throughout mountains and valleys in their territories. There were 10 winter villages. The Okanagan people were very skilled at stock raising and had horses for a century and a half. Horses made long-distance trading and traveling journeys much easier. Most Okanagan people, like First Nations, were growing potatoes by 1840. By 1860, miners and farmers were moving into the Okanagan Valley and squatting on traditional sites. Okanagan chiefs agreed to permit Europeans to share land and resources as long as First Nations people could continue their traditional practices.
Reserve lands were set aside for the Okanagan people. Substantial reserves of lands were marked out of the local lands commissioner, William Cox, guided by the Okanagan chief. Most flat lands around southern and northern ends of Okanagan Lake were included on reserve lands, as well as village sites, fishing camps, and gardens. Okanagan people were viewed as simply an obstacle in the way of progress. A farmer brought 200 head of cattle down from the mountains into a valley for the winter. The farmer was unwilling to pay the Penticton people, so he moved to a less desirable location where almost all of his cattle died. In 1866, reserve lands were slashed in size. James Douglas retired in 1864. Things were taken over by Joseph Trutch. New, smaller, and less valuable lands were set out by a local magistrate named Hines. The way of life in the Okanagan
Was the owner of a ranch near Vernon that had great influence on development of agriculture, and he became Governor General of Canada. He initiated many of the changes in the valley, encouraging settlement, beginning the orchid industry, and building irrigation systems. Aberdeen relied on First Nations laborers to pick the hops. Hops are one of the many crops grown at Coldstream and were shipped to Britain. Okanagan people were the major workforce. First Nations workers were not paid in cash but rather coupons, colored cards printed with different denominations which could only be cashed at local stores. In the 20th century, the cattle industry was disappearing. Grasslands were overgrazed, more settlers were moving in, dividing land in smaller sections with fences. Fruit farming became the main form of agriculture. In dry, hot summers, expensive irrigation systems were indispensable. Most product was used for the farmer's survival, but there was usually leftovers to sell. In 1890, the realities of the reserve system brought development to a halt. More people turned to farming and fields were expanded, which took over the reserves. A chief applied for more land, but in return got land taken from him. First Nations people had very little access to fruit farming and water irrigation systems. The Okanagan people could not own land individually. In some cases, farmers were forced to defy the laws and use water to save their crops, only to be thrown in jail. Okanagan people had to settle for working as laborers on the farms of newcomers. Farmers depended on them for much of the work required to send fruit off to the market.